What if the person you trust the most is secretly deceiving you right before your eyes? As Tu travels to the city expecting a confrontation, Trinh wins her sympathy with a heartbreaking story, while Quan races against mounting pressure in a collapsing business deal. But when he finally finds them laughing together, a shocking confrontation reveals that not everything is as it seems. Subscribe now and join us as this emotional drama takes an even darker turn. The bus slowly entered the city as Tu stared out the window. The countryside roads had long disappeared behind her. In their place stood rows of tall buildings, crowded intersections, and endless streams of people moving in every direction. Yet despite the noise surrounding her, her thoughts remained focused on only one thing: Trinh, the woman she was about to meet. The woman who had unknowingly become one of the biggest sources of conflict in her relationship with Quan. As the bus continued forward, Tu replayed countless possibilities in her mind. She had imagined this meeting many times. Some versions ended in arguments, others ended in tears, a few ended in complete silence. No matter how she pictured it, she had always assumed there would be tension. After everything that had happened, how could there not be? The pressure surrounding Quan had grown heavier every day. His family was unhappy, his work was suffering. The relationship between everyone involved seemed more complicated than ever. And at the center of all those problems stood Trinh. At least that was what Tu had believed. When the bus finally arrived, she stepped onto the crowded sidewalk and took a deep breath. Her heart was beating faster than usual. Not from fear, but from uncertainty. She still didn't know exactly what she planned to say. Only that this conversation needed to happen. A short while later, she arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet. The place was quiet compared to the busy streets outside. Soft music played in the background. Several customers sat scattered throughout the room. The atmosphere felt calm, far calmer than the storm of emotions she had expected. Then she saw Trinh, sitting alone near the window, waiting. For a brief moment, Tu paused. This was the first time she had faced Trinh alone. No Quan, no family members, no outside pressure, just the two of them. Trinh looked up and noticed her. Immediately she stood. A small smile appeared on her face. Not arrogant, not hostile, not challenging, just calm. That alone surprised Tu because it was completely different from what she had prepared herself for. "Thank you for coming," Trinh said softly. Tu nodded, then slowly took her seat. An awkward silence settled between them. Neither seemed sure how to begin. The waiter arrived and took their orders. Only after he left did the conversation finally start. "I know this isn't easy," Trinh said first. Tu remained quiet, listening, watching carefully, trying to understand the person sitting across from her. For several seconds, Trinh lowered her gaze. When she spoke again, her voice sounded noticeably softer. "To be honest, things haven't been easy for me either." The statement immediately caught Tu attention, because it wasn't what she expected. She had expected excuses, defensiveness, perhaps even blame. Instead, Trinh sounded tired, almost vulnerable. "I know everyone probably thinks I'm the problem," Trinh continued, "but the truth is, I've been struggling too." Tu looked at her without speaking. The sincerity in Trin's expression appeared genuine, at least on the surface. And that was exactly what Trinh wanted. Because from the moment she agreed to this meeting, she already knew how she intended to handle it. Not through confrontation, not through arguments, not through pressure. Those methods would only push Tu away. Instead, she had chosen something far more effective: trust. If she could gain Tu trust, everything else would become easier, much easier. Across the table, Tu continued listening. Slowly, the tension inside her began to soften. Trinh took advantage of the moment. "My father has very strong expectations," she sighed. "Sometimes I feel like I can't make my own decisions." The words landed exactly where she intended, because they mirrored many of the struggles Quan himself had been facing. Immediately, Tu felt a hint of sympathy, perhaps for the first time. She had spent so long viewing Trinh as part of the problem that she had never considered whether Trinh might also be under pressure. The possibility had never crossed her mind. Seeing the reaction she wanted, Trinh continued, "There are days when I don't know what the right thing is anymore." She looked down at her hands. then forced a sad smile. "I just want everyone to be okay." The performance was flawless. Every pause, every expression, every carefully chosen word. Nothing happened by accident. And slowly, exactly as she hoped, Tu Loc's defenses began to lower. For the next hour, the conversation continued. The two women spoke about many things, about pressure, about family expectations, about difficult choices, about the situation surrounding Quan. At one point, Trinh finally spoke the words she knew would have the strongest effect. "I really do love Quan." The statement surprised Tu Lac, not because she doubted it, but because Trinh said it without anger, without competition, without trying to claim ownership. Instead, she sounded heartbroken. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Her eyes grew slightly red. "If I could choose, I wouldn't want any of this." Tu Lac stared at her. The pain in Trin's voice sounded real, painful enough that she found herself believing it. Little by little, sympathy replaced suspicion. Understanding replaced hostility. The conversation became easier, warmer, more personal. And as the minutes passed, something unexpected happened. Tu Lac began seeing Trinh differently. Not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as another woman trapped in a difficult situation. Another person struggling beneath family expectations. Another person trying to protect someone she cared about. For the first time, she felt sorry for her. Very sorry. Meanwhile, Trinh noticed every change in Tu Lac's expression. Every softened glance. Every sign of trust. And inside, she smiled, not outwardly. Not enough for anyone to notice. But deep inside, she knew her plan was working. Much faster than expected. Much easier than expected. Tu Lac was exactly the kind of person Trinh had anticipated. Kind-hearted, empathetic, unable to ignore someone else's pain, especially when that pain appeared genuine, which made her vulnerable, very vulnerable. The more the conversation continued, the closer the two women seemed to become. The tension that had existed at the beginning of the meeting slowly disappeared. Eventually, they were no longer speaking like rivals. They were speaking like friends, even sisters. At one point, Tu Lac reached across the table and gently held Trin's hand. "You've been carrying a lot too." The words were sincere, completely sincere, because Tu Lac truly believed them. For a brief second, Trinh almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, but because everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. Still, she maintained her expression perfectly. A grateful smile appeared. "Thank you for understanding." And as Tu Lac smiled back, Trinh lowered her eyes for a moment, hiding the satisfaction growing inside her. Because she knew something Tu Lac didn't. This meeting had never been about honesty. It had never been about understanding. It had never been about friendship. It was about trust. And trust, once earned, could become a powerful weapon. A much more effective weapon than conflict. A much more dangerous weapon than hostility. Outside the cafe window, the afternoon sun slowly drifted lower in the sky. Neither woman noticed. Neither realized that somewhere else in the city, another storm was already beginning to form. A storm involving Quan. One that would soon bring all three of them back together. And when that happened, the fragile trust forming between Tu Lac and Trinh would face its first real test. While Tu Lac and Trinh continued talking inside the cafe, the atmosphere at Quan's company was completely different. The calm conversation taking place between the two women stood in sharp contrast to the tension building inside the office building several kilometers away. Quan had barely arrived at work when the problems started piling up. One meeting ended only for another to begin. One phone call was immediately followed by the next. Documents covered his desk. Messages continued arriving. And throughout the entire morning, an uncomfortable feeling refused to leave him. Something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't identify the source. But the feeling remained, as if an unseen problem was quietly developing somewhere beyond his sight. Quan rubbed his temples and leaned back in his chair. The previous weeks had already pushed him close to exhaustion. Every day seemed heavier than the one before. The pressure from Trin's father had not disappeared. If anything, it had become stronger. The businessman had made it clear that his patience was running out. He wanted answers. He wanted decisions. And most importantly, he wanted control. Control over the situation. Control over the future. Control over Quan. Unfortunately for him, Quan wasn't willing to surrender that easily. A knock interrupted his thoughts. One of his employees entered, carrying several documents. "There is something you need to see." The serious expression immediately caught Quan's attention. The employee placed a printed email on the desk. Quan picked it up. The moment he finished reading, his expression darkened. The email contained a warning, a very serious warning. One of the company's most important business contracts was suddenly at risk. A key partner was reconsidering the agreement. Several concerns had been raised. Several conditions had changed. Nothing had been officially canceled yet, but the possibility was clearly there. And if the deal collapsed, the consequences would be enormous. Quan slowly lowered the paper. His jaw tightened. Another problem, another battle, another source of pressure. For a few moments, he remained silent. Then he immediately began making calls. The next several hours passed in a blur. Meetings, negotiations, phone conferences, endless discussions. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted solutions. Everyone wanted results. But no one seemed interested in how much pressure was being placed on the person expected to fix everything. By early afternoon, Quan finally had a brief moment to himself. For the first time all day, he reached for his phone. Almost immediately, he thought of Ly. He hadn't heard from her since leaving the countryside. Normally, that wouldn't concern him, but today felt different. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was worry. Perhaps it was simply because he knew how much had been happening recently. Without hesitation, he called her. The phone rang, and rang, and rang again. No answer. Quan frowned. That was unusual. Ly almost always answered, even if she was busy, even if she couldn't talk. She would usually send a message. This time, nothing happened. The call ended. Quan tried again several minutes later. Still no answer. A strange sense of unease settled in his chest. He opened their message history. No new messages, no updates, nothing. At first, he tried to ignore it, telling himself she was probably occupied. Maybe she was shopping, maybe she was resting, maybe she simply hadn't heard the phone. Yet the feeling wouldn't disappear. As the afternoon continued, he called again, and again. Still nothing. Each unanswered call made him more uncomfortable, because deep down, he knew something. Ly was in the city today. She had come here specifically to meet Trinh. The realization immediately sharpened his concern. His mind replayed their last conversation. He remembered her telling him she wanted to talk to Trinh. He remembered feeling uneasy about it. At the time, he hadn't tried to stop her, but he certainly hadn't liked the idea. Because unlike Ly, he knew Trinh extremely well, better than anyone. He knew how intelligent she was, how patient she could be, how carefully she planned things, and that was exactly what worried him. Back inside the cafe, however, Ly remained completely unaware of Quan's growing anxiety. The atmosphere had changed dramatically since the beginning of the meeting. What started as a cautious conversation had become surprisingly comfortable. The two women had spent hours talking about life, about family, about expectations, about the difficult situations they found themselves trapped inside. At several points, both even laughed, not because the problems were funny, but because sharing burdens often made them feel lighter, at least temporarily. Ly found herself increasingly sympathetic toward Trinh. The woman sitting across from her seemed nothing like the person she had imagined. Instead of arrogance, she saw vulnerability. Instead of manipulation, she saw sadness. Instead of hostility, she saw someone struggling. Or at least that was what she believed. Trinh noticed every change, every smile, every moment of trust. And inside, she couldn't help feeling satisfied. The plan was working, even better than expected. There had been moments when she worried Ly might remain guarded, moments when she worried suspicion would remain, but those concerns had disappeared. Now Ly looked at her almost like a friend, exactly what Trinh wanted. A warm smile crossed her face, this time completely genuine, not because she cared about Ly, but because success was becoming visible. Meanwhile, across the city, Quan's patience was running out. The unanswered calls continued bothering him. Eventually, he pushed aside the work on his desk and stood. His instincts were screaming at him. Something wasn't right. Perhaps he was overreacting. Perhaps nothing was wrong, but he couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. After making several inquiries, he finally learned where the meeting was taking place. Without wasting another minute, he left the office. The drive felt longer than usual. Traffic seemed slower. Every red light felt personal. His grip tightened around the steering wheel. The entire journey, one thought repeated itself endlessly. Please let me be wrong. Please let this be nothing. Please let Tu Lac be okay. By the time he arrived, his anxiety had reached its peak. He stepped out of the car and immediately searched the area. Then he saw them. Through the cafe window, Tu Lac and Trinh, sitting together, laughing, smiling, talking comfortably. The sight stopped him cold. For a brief moment, he simply stared, disbelief mixed with concern, because this was exactly what he had feared. Not conflict, not arguments, trust. Trust was far more dangerous. Without hesitation, Quan pushed open the cafe door and walked inside. Both women looked up. The smiles on their faces immediately faded. Tu Lac stood first. Quan? Relief appeared in her voice, but Quan barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on Trinh. The two stared at each other, one suspicious, one seemingly innocent. Finally, Quan spoke. What are you doing? The question wasn't directed at Tu Lac. It was directed at Trinh. The atmosphere instantly changed. The warmth disappeared. Tension replaced it. Several nearby customers glanced over. Trinh blinked in apparent confusion. I don't understand. Quan's expression hardened. You know exactly what I mean. Tu Lac immediately stepped forward, trying to calm the situation. But Quan wasn't finished. Weeks of frustration, weeks of pressure, weeks of suspicion. Everything seemed to surface at once. He looked directly at Trinh. What game are you playing now? The question hung heavily in the air. For the first time all afternoon, genuine silence filled the table. Trin's expression shifted, not into anger, not into defensiveness. Instead, she looked hurt, almost wounded. Exactly the reaction she wanted him to see. Exactly the reaction she wanted Tu Lac to see. And beside them, Tu Lac found herself caught completely in the middle, not understanding why the situation was suddenly spiraling out of control, not realizing that the most dangerous part of Trin's plan had only just begun. The atmosphere inside the cafe changed in an instant. Only moments earlier, the space had been filled with calm conversation and occasional laughter. Now an uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Several nearby customers discreetly glanced in their direction before returning to their own conversations. Tu Lac stood frozen between Quan and Trinh. Neither woman had expected Quan to suddenly appear, and judging by the look on his face, he had arrived carrying far more frustration than either of them realized. Quan's eyes never left Trinh. Weeks of pressure, weeks of suspicion, weeks of unanswered questions, all of it seemed to be surfacing at once. What game are you playing? He asked again. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make the tension unmistakable. Trinh stared at him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then a look of confusion slowly crossed her face. The reaction appeared completely natural, as though she genuinely didn't understand why he was upset. But behind that innocent expression, her mind was working quickly. This wasn't ideal. She had hoped to gain even more of Tu Lac's trust before Quan intervened. Still, she wasn't worried. In fact, part of her felt confident, because Quan's reaction might actually help her. The angrier he appeared, the more reasonable she would seem by comparison. And the more unreasonable he looked, the more likely Tu Lac would defend her, which was exactly what happened. Quan, Tu Lac said softly. Please calm down. Quan looked at her. The concern in his eyes was immediate. I'm calm. No, you're not. Tu Lac stepped closer. Several hours earlier, she might have understood his suspicion, but now things felt different. Everything Trinh had shared, everything she had confessed, everything she appeared to be struggling with. It had changed Tu Lac's perspective. She no longer saw Trinh as a threat, not after hearing her side of the story, not after realizing how much pressure she seemed to be carrying herself. Quan glanced between the two women. The sight only made his unease grow stronger. Tu Lac looked comfortable around Trinh. Too comfortable. And that worried him more than anything, because he knew how convincing Trinh could be when she wanted something. Very convincing. I've been calling you for hours, Quan said. Tu Lac immediately reached for her phone. The moment she looked at the screen, her eyes widened. Several missed calls, several messages, all from Quan. I'm sorry, her expression turned apologetic. My phone was on silent, Quan sighed. Part of him wanted to believe that explanation was enough. But another part couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He turned back toward Trinh. The woman remained seated, calm, collected, almost completely relaxed, as though nothing unusual had happened. That alone made him suspicious, because every instinct he had was warning him not to trust what he was seeing. What exactly have you been telling her? Quan asked. This time the question was direct. Trinh looked surprised, then hurt, at least outwardly. I haven't done anything. Quan let out a short laugh, one without humor. You expect me to believe that? The tension immediately rose again. Tu Lac stepped between them. Enough! Both turned toward her. For the first time since arriving, she sounded firm. You're misunderstanding her. Quan stared at her. The words hit him harder than he expected. Because only a few hours earlier, Tu Lac herself had been uncertain about meeting Trinh. Now she was defending her, strongly, without hesitation. The change happened too quickly, far too quickly. Tu Lac, Quan said carefully. You don't know her the way I do. The words were meant as a warning, but they had the opposite effect. Because after everything Trinh had shared, Tu Lac interpreted the statement differently. She saw it as a judgment, an assumption, a refusal to believe that people could be misunderstood. Maybe I don't, she replied, but maybe we've all misunderstood her too. The sentence landed like a blow, not because it was cruel, but because it confirmed Quan's fears. Trinh had already gained her trust, far faster than he imagined possible. Across the table, Trinh lowered her eyes, hiding the satisfaction she felt. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Not perfectly, but close enough. The disagreement between Quan and Tu Lac wasn't severe, not yet, but a seed had been planted, a small crack, and small cracks often became much larger over time, especially when trust was involved. Still maintaining her innocent expression, Trinh finally spoke. I don't want you two arguing because of me. Her voice sounded soft, almost guilty. If my presence is causing problems, maybe I should leave. The performance was flawless. Every word positioned her as the reasonable one. Every sentence made her appear considerate. Every gesture made her seem harmless. Tu Lac immediately shook her head. No. The response came naturally, without thinking, because from her perspective, Trinh had done nothing wrong. She had simply shared her feelings, shared her struggles, shared her concerns. That was all. Meanwhile, Quan watched the exchange unfold, and the more he watched, the worse he felt, because he recognized exactly what was happening. Perhaps not every detail, but enough to know that something about the situation felt wrong, very wrong. Unfortunately, proving it was another matter entirely. After several tense moments, Quan made a decision. Continuing the conversation would accomplish nothing, at least not here, not now, not while emotions were already running high. He reached for Tu Lac's hand. We're leaving. Tu Lac looked surprised. Quan, we're leaving. His tone wasn't angry, just firm, very firm. For a moment she hesitated, then finally nodded. She turned toward Trinh. A look of regret crossed her face. I'm sorry. Trinh smiled gently. It's okay. The understanding expression only reinforced Tu Lac's trust. The two women exchanged a final glance, one filled with genuine concern, the other hiding intentions that remained invisible. Then Tu Lac followed Quan toward the exit. The moment they stepped outside, the tension returned. Neither spoke immediately. The city moved around them. Cars passed. Pedestrians hurried by. But for several seconds, the two walked in silence. Finally, Tu Lac broke it. Why did you do that? Quan stopped walking. His exhaustion was evident. Not just physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, mental exhaustion, the exhaustion of carrying too many burdens for too long. Because I don't trust her. The answer came instantly, without hesitation. Tu Lac sighed. You didn't even give her a chance. Quan stared at her. That's exactly what worries me. She frowned. What does that mean? For a moment he struggled to find the right words. How could he explain something that was mostly instinct, mostly experience, mostly years of knowing someone better than anyone else? Finally he spoke. Tu Lac, Some people don't attack directly. The sentence immediately caught her attention. Quan continued. They smile. They listen. They gain your trust. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. The warning hung between them, but Tu Lac remained unconvinced, because the woman she met today didn't resemble the person Quan was describing. Not at all. And that difference was exactly what made the situation so dangerous. Far above them, dark clouds slowly began gathering over the city skyline. Neither noticed, neither realized that while they were arguing about trust, someone else was already celebrating. Someone who believed the first stage of a much larger plan had succeeded. And at that very moment, only a short distance away, Trinh was receiving an unexpected visitor. Someone who had been waiting all day to hear how the meeting went. Someone whose ambitions stretched far beyond a simple conversation in a cafe. Someone who had taught Trinh everything she was doing now. Her father. After leaving the cafe, Quan and Tu Lac continued walking down the busy sidewalk. The tension between them hadn't disappeared. In fact, it seemed to grow with every passing minute. Neither wanted to argue. Neither wanted to hurt the other. But they were seeing the same situation from completely different perspectives, and that difference was becoming impossible to ignore. Cars moved steadily through the streets. Office workers hurried home after a long day. The city continued operating as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet for Quan, the uneasiness in his chest remained stronger than ever. He glanced at Tu Lac. She looked thoughtful, confused, almost troubled, not because of Trinh, but because of him. And that realization hurt more than he expected. For weeks, he had been trying to protect her from the pressure surrounding his life. Now it felt as though his attempts were pushing her further away. Tu Lac. His voice softened. She looked at him. Immediately, some of the tension faded. Because despite everything, she knew he cared. And despite everything, he knew she cared too. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I know. I was worried. Tu Lac sighed. I understand that. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she continued. But I think you're judging her too quickly. The sentence landed heavily, not because it was cruel, but because it confirmed exactly what Quan feared. The meeting had changed something. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough. Enough that Tu Lac was now defending Trinh. Enough that she was questioning his warnings. Quan looked away toward the traffic, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to explain what he felt. The problem was that he didn't have proof, only experience, only instincts, only years of knowing the person Trinh truly was. And instincts were difficult to explain, especially to someone as kind-hearted as Tu Lac. Finally, he spoke. Maybe I'm wrong. The word surprised even him. Tu Lac immediately looked relieved. But before she could respond, he continued. Maybe she has changed. Maybe she's being honest. Maybe everything she told you is true. A brief pause followed. Then his expression hardened slightly. But I still don't trust her. The certainty in his voice was unmistakable. Tu Lac could hear it, feel it, and although she didn't completely agree, she understood that convincing him otherwise wouldn't be easy. Not today, perhaps not anytime soon. Eventually, they stopped discussing the subject. Neither wanted the disagreement to grow larger, so they shifted to safer topics. The trip home, work, the countryside, anything that could ease the tension. Yet even as they talked, Quan's mind remained occupied by the image he had witnessed inside the cafe. Tu Lac laughing, smiling, trusting Trinh. The memory continued bothering him, because deep down he believed something important had happened today, something dangerous, something he couldn't quite see yet. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Trinh remained seated inside the cafe. The smile she had worn throughout the meeting slowly disappeared. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to relax. The performance was over, at least for now. She picked up her coffee cup and stared through the window. People continued moving outside. Cars continued passing. Life continued normally. And yet she felt unusually satisfied. The meeting had gone better than expected, far better. When Tu Lac first arrived, Trinh knew earning her trust wouldn't be easy. She expected resistance, suspicion, questions. Instead, everything had unfolded almost perfectly. Tu Lac was exactly the person she anticipated. Kind, compassionate, empathetic, the kind of person who couldn't ignore someone else's pain, especially when that pain appeared genuine, and Trinh had made sure it appeared genuine. A faint smile touched her lips. Not the sad smile she had shown Tu Lac, not the vulnerable smile she had shown Quan. A different smile, one that revealed quiet satisfaction. The cafe door suddenly opened. The sound immediately drew her attention. A familiar figure entered, an older man wearing an expensive suit, confident, calm, completely at ease. The moment Trinh saw him, she straightened slightly. Her father, the man responsible for much of the pressure currently surrounding Quan. The man who always seemed 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He approached the table and sat down. His eyes immediately studied his daughter. Looking for clues, looking for results, looking for confirmation. Finally, a small smile appeared on his face. "It went well?" Trinh couldn't help smiling back. "It went very well." The older man nodded, as though he expected nothing less. A waiter approached. He ordered a drink, then turned his attention back toward her. "Tell me everything." Trinh did exactly that. She described the conversation, the emotions, the reactions, every important detail. As she spoke, her father's smile grew wider. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he appear surprised. When she finally finished, he leaned back in his chair. Satisfied, very satisfied. "I told you," Trinh nodded. "You were right." The older man chuckled softly. Direct attacks never work. His tone carried the confidence of someone repeating a lesson learned long ago. If you fight people openly, they resist. They defend themselves. They become cautious. He lifted his coffee cup. But if they trust you, a faint smile crossed his face. They lower their guard on their own. Trinh listened carefully, because she understood exactly what he meant. The meeting with Tu Lac had proven it. At the beginning, Tu Lac arrived expecting conflict. By the end, she viewed Trinh almost like a friend, perhaps even like a sister. The transformation had happened surprisingly fast, and that made the victory even sweeter. Her father observed the satisfaction in her eyes, then offered a nod of approval. "Good!" The single word carried genuine praise, something that rarely happened. Trinh smiled. Being recognized by him still mattered more than she liked admitting. For several moments, both sat quietly. Then Trinh asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. "What happens next?" The older man looked out the window, watching the city traffic, watching people move through their ordinary lives. His expression slowly changed. The satisfaction remained, but something colder appeared beneath it, something more calculating. "We continue." Trinh frowned slightly. "Continue what?" This time, the smile that appeared on her father's face carried no warmth at all. "The plan." The simple answer sent a chill through the air. Trinh already knew there was a larger objective, but hearing him say it directly felt different, more serious, more real. The older man lowered his voice. "No rushing, no pressure, no direct confrontation." He tapped a finger lightly against the table. "Those methods only create resistance." Trinh nodded slowly, listening, learning, the way she always had. Her father continued, "Trust takes time. But once someone gives it to you..." He paused, a faint smile returning. "You can guide them anywhere." The words lingered between them, heavy, calculated, dangerous. For the first time all afternoon, Trinh found herself wondering just how far he intended to go. Yet she asked no questions, because she already knew the answer, as far as necessary. Outside, dark clouds continued gathering over the city. The sunlight that had filled the afternoon was slowly disappearing. The sky seemed to reflect the growing uncertainty surrounding everyone involved. Several kilometers away, Quan and Tu Lac were already heading home. Neither aware of the conversation taking place, neither aware that the meeting they believed had ended peacefully was actually the beginning of something much larger. Something carefully planned. Something carefully hidden. Back inside the cafe, Trinh finally broke the silence. "Do you really think she'll trust me?" Her father laughed softly, not because the question was foolish, but because he considered the answer obvious. "She already does." The confidence in his voice was absolute. Trinh thought back to the conversation. The smiles, the sympathy, The concern, the way Tu Lac defended her in front of Quan. Slowly, a smile appeared. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the first step had already succeeded. Her father noticed the expression, then nodded approvingly. Very good. He stood, straightened his jacket, and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he paused beside the table. One final sentence escaped his lips, a sentence that revealed far more than either Quan or Tu Lac could imagine. Remember, he looked directly at his daughter. You don't win by fighting head-on. His smile widened slightly. You win by becoming someone they choose to trust. With that, he walked away, leaving Trinh alone with her thoughts, and leaving behind a question that neither Quan nor Tu Lac knew to ask. What exactly were the two of them planning? And more importantly, how much damage would be done before the truth finally came to light? The drive back from the city felt unusually quiet. Normally, whenever Quan and Tu Lac spent time together, there was always something to talk about. Even the simplest conversations could make the journey feel shorter. But today was different. The disagreement at the cafe still lingered between them. Neither wanted to argue. Neither wanted to upset the other. Yet both were carrying thoughts they couldn't completely let go of. Outside the window, the city gradually gave way to smaller roads. The noise faded. The traffic thinned. Fields and distant hills slowly reappeared. But even as the scenery changed, Quan's uneasiness remained. He glanced toward Tu Lac. She was staring out the passenger side window, lost in thought, perhaps replaying the conversation with Trinh, perhaps replaying the argument with him, perhaps both. Finally, Tu Lac broke the silence. I think she's lonely. Quan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He already knew who she meant. Neither of them needed to say the name. For several seconds, he didn't respond. Then he exhaled slowly. Tu Lac, I know what you're going to say. She turned toward him. I know you don't trust her. Quan nodded. Because I don't. His answer came immediately, without hesitation, without uncertainty. Tu Lac studied his expression. The concern she saw there was genuine. That much she couldn't deny. He wasn't acting out of jealousy. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was worried, truly worried. The problem was that everything she had seen that day told a different story. The Trinh she met wasn't manipulative, wasn't arrogant, wasn't hostile. Instead, she seemed trapped, just like Quan, just like herself. The more Tu Lac thought about it, the more sympathy she felt. I think she's under a lot of pressure too. Quan remained silent, not because he didn't hear her, but because he had heard similar explanations before. People often revealed only the parts of themselves they wanted others to see, especially when they were trying to earn trust. And that was exactly what bothered him. The timing, the sudden vulnerability, the sudden honesty, the sudden friendship. Everything had happened too quickly, far too quickly. But no matter how many concerns filled his mind, he knew one thing. Pushing harder right now would only make things worse. So he let the conversation end there, at least for the moment. As evening approached, they finally arrived back at the countryside house. The familiar sight of the passion fruit vines greeted them. The cool breeze, the peaceful atmosphere, the quiet roads. Normally, returning here helped relieve stress, but today Quan found it difficult to relax. Throughout dinner, he remained distracted. Several times he caught himself staring at his phone. Several times he considered saying something more. Yet each time he stopped himself. Across the table, Tu Lac noticed. She knew him too well not to, but she also knew that continuing the discussion would accomplish nothing. So instead, she tried to lighten the mood, talking about the harvest, talking about the garden, talking about everyday things. Little by little, the tension eased. Not completely, but enough. By late evening, Quan finally appeared calmer, still concerned, still suspicious, but calmer. Eventually, they sat outside beneath the fading light. The countryside had become quiet again. Crickets chirped in the distance. A gentle breeze moved through the vines. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, and yet neither of them realized that hundreds of kilometers away, another conversation was taking place. A conversation that would eventually affect both of them. Back in the city, Trinh sat alone inside her apartment. The performance she had maintained throughout the day was gone. No more tears, no more vulnerability, No more carefully crafted sadness, only silence. She stood near the window overlooking the city lights. Her father's words continued replaying in her mind. You don't win by fighting head-on. You win by becoming someone they choose to trust. At first, she had questioned the strategy. Part of her believed direct competition would be faster, simpler, more effective. But today's meeting had proven otherwise. Tu Lac arrived expecting conflict, yet she left believing she had found a friend. The transformation still amazed her, not because it was difficult, but because it happened so easily, too easily. A faint smile appeared on Trin's face. Then her phone vibrated. A message. Her father. Only a few words. How are you feeling? Trin stared at the screen, then typed a short reply. Everything is going according to plan. Several seconds later, another message appeared. Good. Nothing more, nothing less. Typical. Yet despite its simplicity, the message carried approval. And approval from him was never given lightly. Trin set the phone down, then returned her gaze to the city skyline. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to think beyond the meeting, beyond the cafe, beyond Quan's sudden appearance, toward the future, toward what came next. Because earning trust was only the first step, and everyone involved knew it. The real question was what happened afterward. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Tu Lac was preparing for bed. The events of the day replayed repeatedly in her mind. The conversation, the emotions, the things Trin had shared, the sadness in her eyes, the pressure from her family, the uncertainty she seemed to carry. Everything felt genuine. Everything felt real. Most importantly, she couldn't stop thinking about one specific moment. The moment Trin said she never wanted anyone to get hurt. The memory lingered, because Tu Lac believed her, completely. And that belief made her feel strangely hopeful. Maybe things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. Maybe understanding was possible. Maybe peace was possible. Maybe everyone had simply been trapped by circumstances. The thought comforted her, enough that she finally began drifting towards sleep. Beside her, however, Quan remained awake. His eyes stared at the ceiling. His thoughts refused to settle. Again and again, he replayed what happened inside the cafe. The smiles, the laughter, the trust. Everything about it felt wrong. Not because Tu Lac had done anything wrong, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that Trin was hiding something. Unfortunately, feelings weren't evidence, and without evidence, there was little he could do. The realization frustrated him, deeply. Still, before eventually falling asleep, he made a silent decision. He would remain vigilant. He would pay attention. And most importantly, he would protect Tu Lac, even if she didn't fully understand why. The next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Birds sang outside. The countryside appeared peaceful once again. Yet beneath that calm surface, invisible threads were already moving. Threads connecting the city and the countryside. Threads connecting Quan, Tu Lac, Trin, and her father. Threads forming a plan that remained hidden from almost everyone involved. Only two people truly understood it, Trin and her father. As for everyone else, they remained unaware. Unaware that trust had become a weapon. Unaware that appearances could be deceiving. Unaware that the meeting they believed had resolved tensions was actually the beginning of something far more dangerous. For now, the mask remained firmly in place. Tu Lac believed she had gained a friend. Quan believed danger was approaching but couldn't prove it, and Trin continued playing her role perfectly. But how long could the deception last? What exactly were Trin and her father truly planning? And when the truth finally surfaced, would it arrive in time to prevent the damage already being set in motion? Those answers remained hidden, waiting quietly in the chapters ahead, waiting for the moment when trust, loyalty, and love would all be tested in ways none of them expected. And somewhere in the distance, a much larger storm was already beginning to form. After returning from the city, Tu Lac remains convinced that Trin is not the enemy she once believed her to be. Moved by Trin's emotional story and apparent struggles with family pressure, she begins to see her as a trusted friend rather than a rival. Meanwhile, Quan cannot shake the feeling that something is wrong. Despite lacking proof, he remains deeply suspicious of Trin and worries that Tu Lac is lowering her guard too quickly. As tension quietly grows between trust and doubt, Trinh and her father celebrate the success of the first stage of their plan. Rather than confronting their opponents directly, they intend to gain trust and influence from within. Unaware of the hidden scheme unfolding around them, Quan and Tu Lac return to their peaceful countryside life, not realizing that a much greater storm is already beginning to take shape.